Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for the first speaker series of 2021 with Michael Chamberland. My name is Anya Quiros, and I am the CASCA Engagement Coordinator. The Central Arizona Conservation Alliance is an initiative of the Desert Botanical Garden that started in 2012, and our mission is to collaborate with various partners around the region, including agencies and other nonprofit organizations and municipalities as well, to preserve and protect our natural open spaces here in Central Arizona. We focus on a lot of different priorities, which include invasive species, which is the reason why we're here tonight, but also native plant material development, education, outreach, and just overall conservation in general and restoration. So we're very excited to have you guys here tonight to join us for this talk. We are going to be focusing on Stinknet and doing a little bit of a deeper dive into Stinknet tonight. And before I move anywhere further, I do want to do some housekeeping notes. Please remember to stay muted throughout the conversation. And if you have any questions that pop up during the presentation, please put those in the chat in the Q&A section, or you can just put those straight into the chat. We will get to them towards the end of the presentation. We have some 15 minutes at the end for some Q&A time. Let's see. Also, if you are going to be using the chat, just remember that there's an option to send a message to panelists or a panelist and attendees. So depending on who you want to send your question to, just be aware of that. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Michael. Michael Chamberland is an assistant agent for the U of A Maricopa County Extension Office, Cooperative Extension Office, and he is also in charge and leads the Maricopa County Master Gardeners Program. He does a lot and is a huge resource for us in regards to landscape and horticulture, and is a wealth of knowledge on Stinknet, and he's doing a lot of work on Stinknet, but also other invasive species of concern, and just in general, a lot of those questions that pop up for residents and community members about what's going on in their yard. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Michael and let him take over and start the presentation. Thanks again, you guys, so much.
Quickly emerged as a significant problem. Stinknet has gone from being largely unknown to most Arizona naturalists during the start of 2019 to a recognized significant noxious weed today. Let's take a quick review of Stinknet's appearance. In this photo are large, robust Stinknet plants in bloom. Those yellow balls are actually clusters of very tiny flowers. Stinknet is a member of the sunflower family, and it is typical of plants in this family to make blooms which are actually a tight cluster of very tiny small flowers. In this close-up photo, you may be able to see some of the open flowers together with closed flower buds, which altogether comprise the spherical flower head. Each tiny flower can mature into a single seed, and the entire spherical flower head has a potential to make over 100 seeds. The young Stinknet plants, after they've germinated, have what's called a rosette, or a kind of a circular arrangement of finely divided leaves. At this stage, these plants could be confused with seedlings of some other native Arizona plants. Stinknet has a distinctive odor when it's crushed, which has been compared to turpentine. Older Stinknet plants, as they grow further, will begin to bolt with upright stems before they flower. So they're producing more elongate and upright stems in this bolting phase. Now, this is an infested area near Anthem in the north part of the Phoenix metro area. All the yellow flowers in this photo are Stinknet. Note the large Stinknet plants, which are getting near the size of small shrubs around the center of the photo, and comparatively smaller plants below them in the foreground. But these are all Stinknet plants. At least all the flowers are. The large, robust Stinknet plants are the ones that are commonly photographed, but under less favorable conditions or plants which had germinated late in the season, they may mature as much smaller plants, like these smaller ones in this photo, sometimes so small that they only have a singular globular flower head, which is smaller, reduced in size than what you would see on the larger, robust plants. Now, the previous 2 winters have experienced above average rainfall, and this has yielded robust growth of large stinknet plants. However, during dry winters, stinknet may grow to be no more than a few inches tall, sometimes with just a single ball-shaped flower head. These diminutive plants may not be immediately recognized by people who are accustomed to seeing pictures just of the large, robust plants. These undersized plants would seem to be less of a menace, but they still generate seeds, which can contribute to the continued spread of stinknet. They will, of course, though, make a lot less seed than the big plants. During very dry winters, such as we've seen during this winter, stinknet may not germinate at all. And if it does not, those seeds can remain as dormant seeds in the soil. Rain later in the winter, as we've been experiencing the last couple of days, can be expected that it may yield some limited germination of stinknet. Now, it's often said that later rains in the course of the winter will stimulate stinknet to germinate, but it's usually less of a flush of germination. So any seeds which do germinate at this point or later during the winter are likely to grow into plants comparable to those in this photo, rather than those big, large stinknet plants. Remember that the large stinknet plants that we saw over the past couple rainy winters, they started germinating in the fall, in November, maybe even in October, and then grew to their large size over the course of an entire winter, which any of them germinating now will not have. After setting seeds, the stinknet plants die. This is a dead stinknet plant with seed heads. These are the same yellow balls or flower heads which have matured to this tan color. Each ball is a cluster of seeds held loosely enough to break apart if the plant is disturbed, such as if you walk through this or if your dog runs through this plant, that's going to break apart these seed heads and start spreading the seeds. However, those seed heads are held together tightly enough so that a moderate wind or even a moderate rain doesn't tend to break up these seed heads. The seed heads will stay on the plant, sometimes for months and occasionally for over a year, while waiting for a disturbance that will break them loose and will likely carry those seeds away in the process. The spherical seed heads are fragile and will crumble, releasing their seeds. However, we are seeing this winter many dried, dead stinknet plants which have held their seeds nearly for a year now and may wind up holding them for a year. Probably this is in part because of the lack of monsoon storms over the summer, which could rattle around the plants enough to break up those seeds. Together with the lack of fall or winter storms, both with the rain or sleet and hail will also break apart these seed heads. But we really haven't had any of that until just past couple days. The stinknet seeds are very tiny, less than a millimeter long. In this photo, the actual seeds are the dark tip on each of these little slivers. So that tiny little darker tip at the end of that little fingernail clipping shaped sliver is the actual seed at the end. Now that paler part of this chaff here, that's the actual dried corolla or petals of the individual flower that constituted a part of that whole spherical seed head. So that remains attached to the seed, or the seed may just fall apart from it, but often they stay attached for a time. Stinknet is native to South Africa. Remember that plants which are invasive exotic species in some parts of the world still have a native range elsewhere in the world. And this is important because it is in South Africa that potential biological control agents might be found to control stinknet. Biological control is a potential possibility for development against stinknet, since the genus it belongs to, the genus Oncosiphon, is not part of the native North American flora. So we probably don't have a plant that's terribly closely related to stinknet, which is native in our area. And generally these potential biological controls are selected to be very specific to a particular species or genus. There's a possibility an insect or fungal pest might be found which specifically attacks stinknet, but not other plants. And that's the kind of research that goes into determining a possible biological control. Stinknet is invasive in Arizona and California. It is also now reported from Nevada and northern Mexico. It's invasive in both eastern and western Australia. In this map, the green regions show the native range in southern Africa, while the purple show the regions of invasion. Stinknet is native to South Africa, and it is also reported from Lesotho, which is an enclaved country within South Africa, noted for its high elevation. The country is entirely above 1,000 meters or above 3,000 feet. Now, we've been describing stinknet as behaving as an obligate winter annual, which does describe its current behavior in southern Arizona. But we do have increased concern that stinknet's invasion of the Sonoran Desert and Southern California does not necessarily mean it lacks the capacity to invade colder regions where it might potentially grow from spring into summer. So we hope that that doesn't prove true, but this note of it from Lesotho is a bit alarming, suggesting it could invade higher elevation regions. Reports mapped by iNaturalist suggest a wider global range of occurrence, but some of those records in iNaturalist are based on misidentifications of an ornamental plant called brass buttons, Cotula coronetifolia, or they may be based on poor or unverifiable photos. So a bunch of records from Europe and Turkey that are shown in there are definitely questionable. The stinknet distribution in Arizona is currently mapped by SciNet and by other mapping efforts. This map shows SciNet's mapped North American accounts of stinknet. It has been documented in Arizona as far north as the Sedona Oak Creek area and as far south in Arizona as Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument along the Mexican border. And observation has been reported from Hermosillo, Sonora, deep into the state of Sonora. Also note the large gap that exists between California and Arizona infestations. Now that gap between the California and Arizona populations, that might just be an area that will fill in over time, or it might reflect something else. It might reflect a different behavior in those two areas. Now, some of these populations shown on the map have been treated and may hopefully no longer be present, such as those in the Organ Pipe area, and some of those around Tucson may have been beaten back. However, other mapping efforts will differ from what's shown here and have reported a wider range of occurrence for stinknet, both in California and also in the Las Vegas area. So the differences between other maps, particularly maps from California, and this map from SciNet, probably reflect different data sets, which have not been shared between these mapping projects, rather than misidentifications such as those which have shown up on iNaturalist. Stinknet is a name we recommend to replace an earlier name of globe chamomile. The name Stinknet better emphasizes the undesirable nature of the weed. And the name Stinknet is consistent with the name for the plant that's being used in California. The name Oncosiphon pilulifer might be new to many people. The name Oncosiphon piluliferum has been the most often used Latin name for stinknet, but examinations of the rules of nomenclature behind the naming of plants is suggesting that the shorter name is the correct one. We can see the name Oncosiphon pilulifer is being quickly adopted on many websites such as CalFlora, iNaturalist, SciNet, and Wikipedia. Thanks to efforts of the Southwest Vegetation Management Association, Stinknet was added to the Arizona State Noxious Weed List in January of 2020. In being added to the State Noxious Weed List, this shows that the Arizona Department of Agriculture recognizes this weed as a significant detriment to agriculture and the environment in Arizona. The noxious weed list is not a statement of the most unpleasant or widespread weeds in the state. Instead, the noxious weed list recognizes those weeds which present the greatest threats to human activities, especially agriculture, commerce, and navigable waterways, which is a hazard presented by some other weeds on the list. The state noxious weed list includes many weeds which are uncommon, or even some not present in Arizona, but which have known characteristics which would make them serious problems if they did enter and start spreading in Arizona. The noxious weed list does not include many invasive exotic weeds which have not met the criteria to be considered significant enough detriments to human activity, such as fillery and Mediterranean grass. So there are a number of publications available, which some of which are available from the web. You can find a publication I wrote called Stinknet, a weed advancing in southern Arizona. And this is a University of Arizona Cooperative Extension publication. And you can download that from the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension web portal. Also available is the short journey from Stinknet introduction and spread to eruptive explosion in Arizona, which has been published in the latest issue of the Plant Press, newsletter of the Arizona Native Plant Society. And you should be able to download that one from the Arizona Native Plant Society website. Also look for in print, I don't believe this is available online, the latest issue, I think this is still the latest issue of Desert Plants, volume 36, number 1, Stinknet, a new invasive non-native plant in the southwestern United States, by Philip Hedrick and Chris McDonald. And this offers a more lengthy study of Stinknet, including incorporation of information that they obtained from efforts to control Stinknet in Australia. So some of the issues of Stinknet, some of the issues that Stinknet presents. Well, one is competition. Stinknet threatens to displace native plants, especially cool season growing native wildflowers, which share the same seasonal life cycle as Stinknet. So a lot of our conspicuous wildflowers that bloom in spring, just like Stinknet, they will germinate in the fall. And if they get a good fall rain to start them, and then continuing rain through the winter, that's what a lot of our wildflowers need to get up to size and create that kind of super bloom of native wildflowers. But unfortunately, Stinknet responds to the same rainfall patterns, and so it is going to be growing large at the same time and will be competing with our native wildflowers. Another stinknet issue is fire. The heavy rains that we received during the winters of 2019 and 2020 produced robust growth of stinknet across Maricopa County. And then these plants dried out and provided tinder for wildfire during the exceptionally dry spring and summer of 2020. So this is a picture up near New River, Arizona, with a really extensive and dense population of stinknet that's dried out and gone to seed. Various brush fires occurred in spring to summer of 2020 on the edge of the Phoenix metro area and in natural areas within the metro area. So these are some burn areas which are shown in gray on this InsaWeb map. These were fires burning in June of 2020 or thereabouts. The Aquila fire burned in the Phoenix Sonoran Preserve, adjacent to the Tramonto community of Phoenix, south of Anthem, causing substantial destruction. Here I've attempted some repeat photography, matching a burned site I photographed with a Google Street View from the same general area along North 27th Avenue. Now this is a northern branch of the Phoenix Sonoran Preserve. And you can see in the Google photo, there's a lot of dried brush, which is pretty certain to be stinknet in that area and helped to fuel this wildfire. The Aquila fire aftermath in the Phoenix Sonoran Preserve, with dead or severely damaged saguaro and desert trees. Now, I would say it's not very likely that these trees or saguaro will come back from that level of damage. Some of the shrubs and possibly some of the perennials might come back depending on how burned the soil was. Despite the considerable destruction, some patches of unburned vegetation, including some stinknet with seeds, remain standing. And I'm not really sure how that is, but I guess this fire was of a sort that it managed to skip a few little areas here and there, but it does provide evidence of what was growing in the site to help fuel that fire. And this is the west side of North 27th Avenue, just across the road, opposite side of the road from that burn area in the last photograph. And this too suggests the density of stinknet cover that likely served to support that kind of fire. And clearly, when you have dried stinknet this close up among residential properties, that this is a real fire hazard for homes and vehicles and properties that are inundated by stinknet in this fashion. Now here's an aerial view of the Skunk Creek drainage. This is the same area just about that I was showing in the previous photos. And this is also an aerial image prior to the fire, which with its yellow tint over so much of this is suggesting a heavy stinknet infestation in bloom that pre-existed before this fire. Although it's also possible that there are other yellow flowers, maybe such as brittlebush, that may be contributing in this photo. So during winters with less rainfall, like we've been experiencing, we can hope for reduced growth of stinknet biomass, which will produce less of a fire hazard. So in poor rainfall years, stinknet can be expected to mature, maybe something closer to the size you see in this photo. So if that happens this spring, I wouldn't imagine the stinknet would likely get much bigger than this if it does germinate due to our current rains. Just won't have enough months in the winter to grow much larger. But the existing problem is that there's still a lot of dried stinknet that's still standing out there. So until that decomposes, until that goes away or gets removed, that may continue to be a fire hazard. The Lake Paris State Recreation Area is located in Riverside County, California. That's in the LA region. And it's been considered a possible introduction site for Stinknet to the United States, because it was in this area of California that Stinknet was first noted. The very first collections documenting Stinknet in the United States were made from this general area back in the early 1980s. Now, prescribed burns have been performed at Lake Paris State Recreation Area to restore habitat there for the endangered Steffen's kangaroo rat. Now, these prescribed burns have not shown a positive control on Stinknet. However, applications of Roundup in the area have shown some positive results in suppressing Stinknet in this location. And this is a photo I grabbed from a campsite review website that shows the yellow flowers of what is very likely Stinknet right in the camping and picnicking area in this campsite review website at campphotos.com. So you can just imagine that Stinknet gets established in a spot like this with campers and picnickers coming in here and parking among this Stinknet. And I'm taking a guess that this is Stinknet in the photo. Certainly, it looks about the right size and color, and it's where we know there's an infestation. So it's very likely that Stinknet could be carried away from these picnic areas by people who are visiting and don't know what they're camping among. Now, research out of California suggests that prescribed burns are not a promising control to control Stinknet. Here's a location in San Diego County with a Stinknet infestation among a mixture of other weeds and native plants. Still a young early spring growth of Stinknet and other weeds here. So this kind of habitat, it's a coastal chaparral habitat in San Diego and the other Southern California counties where this grows. And there are a lot of fundamental differences in this coastal chaparral from our Sonoran Desert. Nonetheless, we can learn from ongoing work out of California that they're doing on Stinknet. But we can also imagine that some Stinknet behavior and responses may prove different here in Arizona. It would also be interesting to look at some genetic samples of the Stinknet in California versus that in Arizona, and to see whether they really are the same genetics. It's pretty easy to imagine that Stinknet arrived in Arizona possibly just from some seeds that were carried over, maybe even by someone who was picnicking at the Lake Paris State Rec area and then drove to Arizona and inadvertently carried some seeds. But we don't know. We don't know if the Arizona populations came from the weedy populations in California, or whether they might have come direct from Africa, or even possibly from the invasive populations in Australia. But possibly some genetic work could provide some clues onto that. So in other words, don't even think about setting a fire to remove Stinknet from residential property. I have had people ask me about this. Don't start fires on residential property to control Stinknet. That's just not the way to go. Other Stinknet issues: allergies. Allergic reactions to Stinknet have been reported. Both respiratory distress and contact dermatitis have been reported. And these seem to be from contact or proximity to large plants in bloom or entire fields of blooming plants. Now, these effects have not been examined or medically characterized as far as I know. I've been asking around the university to see if I can find anyone in the medical field who would like to take interest in working on this, but so far no luck. Does the smoke from burning Stinknet present allergenic hazards? Well, we don't know, but generally the smoke from wildfires should be avoided as best as possible, as it'll contain fumes from many different burning plants and possibly garbage and other stuff that's being burned in the fire. So you just want to stay away from that smoke regardless. Allergic reactions warrant caution if you're handling or removing stinknet. And this can be a concern when weed whacking or pulling stinknet. It would be a good idea to wear gloves and pay attention in case any reactions start to develop. And reactions are most likely to be expected with encounters with green growing plants, and especially the mature flowering plants, and are less likely to be expected from contact with dried stinknet or its seeds. But like I say, this is not a phenomenon that's really been studied yet, as far as I know. Another aspect of allergies is that bundles of stinknet have shown up in Phoenix area farmers markets being sold as wild chamomile. Now, hopefully the growing public awareness of stinknet has or will put a stop to this practice. The move to the name Stinknet rather than globe chamomile should help get us away from the association with herbal chamomile. Allergenic effects are of real concern if herbal uses of the plant are being encouraged. So stinknet control. Aspects of stinknet biology offer prospects for mechanical controls of stinknet. Stinknet is recognizable and not easily confused with our native Arizona plants once it's grown beyond the seedling stage. Stinknet may be confused with pineapple weed, Matricaria discoidea. However, this is just another weedy invasive plant. So if you eliminate this one by mistake, it's not a huge deal. The pineapple weed is a smaller plant. It does have a pineapple-like odor to the foliage. And the flower heads are more of a yellow-green. They're not as bright a yellow, and they tend to be more of an acorn shape rather than the spherical shape. Stinknet may also be confused with Australian water buttons, Cotula australis. But this again is another weedy invasive, so if you wind up controlling this, it's also not a problem. This is a much smaller plant. There's no real odor to the foliage, and the flower heads are much smaller and disc-shaped. In fact, this plant blooms, and you don't even really know it's blooming. The whole flower head is so small and inconspicuous, it's hard to see that the flowers are actually maturing. Seedlings of various native plants may have finely divided leaves and can look a lot like stinknet seedlings. At this stage, stinknet could be distinguishable by the turpentine-like odor of the foliage, but this may not always be reliable with small plants and may depend on the acuity of your olfactory system. In other words, it may depend on how good you smell. So here on the left is a young stinknet plant, which is pretty similar looking to this Cainactus seedling in the center, and might potentially be confused with the Descurania pinnata on the right. There are also other additional wild native Arizona wildflowers that might be confused with stinknet too. Stinknet becomes more readily identified when it bolts with its upright stems, and this does appear to be a requirement before stinknet will flower, that it will start elongating stems first. Here you can see longer stinknet stems bolting or elongating or extending out from the basal seedling rosette, which is kind of hard to see near the base of this. Keep in mind that stinknet can be pretty variable in growth form depending on how much water it received and how crowded it is by other vegetation, especially other stinknet plants, because once stinknet gets well established in an area, it can actually be crowding against itself and growing much more narrow and upright. So concerning stinknet control, it is most important to eliminate stinknet before it goes to seed. Stinknet is a cool season growing annual plant, and all of the stinknet plants will die with the summer heat in the desert. The way the plant persists is through viable seeds, which remain in the environment. Seeds will remain viable in the soil, a situation that's called the soil seed bank, for at least several years. Also, the seeds remain viable while they are perched on top of the dry dead plants, where the seed may remain for a considerable time. We've certainly seen it up to a year and possibly more with those seeds still stuck on the top of the dried plants. The biology of this seed pool is not entirely understood, but it is expected that these seeds will remain viable on the dead plants for at least a good while their presence up there on top of the stems improves their chance for dispersal. And once those seeds have fallen and hit the ground, they're not likely to disperse much further after that. Now, many wild native plants like Peridly emryi also have they're members of the sunflower family that have loosely attached seeds, but the Peridly will drop its seeds and deposit them into the soil seed bank right away after that seed, or very soon after that seed is matured. And the larger seeds of the Peridly would probably get eaten up by seed-eating birds rather quickly if they did stay on top of the stems. Now, these stinknet seeds are so tiny, or maybe because they are unfamiliar, I've not heard any accounts of seed-eating birds going for them. So it doesn't really seem like anything is eating these seeds, either because it's just not familiar, or the seeds are altogether so small they have very little food value in them. There are aspects of stinknet biology that offer prospects for mechanical controls. Stinknet is fairly easily recognized. Stinknet must bolt before it can flower, and stinknet must flower before it can set any seed. Stinknet has no perennial structures which survive more than a year. It depends entirely on seed to reproduce. So it has no bulbs, no rhizomes, nothing that's going to survive for over a year, except for those seeds. So if you can stop it from making its seeds, then you've stopped that method of reproduction. Stinknet does not have an extensive root system. The plants may be easily pulled, at least if you're dealing with plants growing in moist soil. Now, obviously, pulling plants like this will only be practical for small outbreaks, and tiny stinknet plants may go unnoticed or might be a little bit more laborsome to pull. And again, if you are pulling stinknet, use caution against allergies if they start to appear. Stinknet can be weed whacked to stop those bolting stems from flowering. If you do weed whack stinknet, the plants have the potential to regrow from the base, but it does buy you some time. It does remove flowers, and then the plant needs more time and more energy to produce additional flowering stems. Now, the regrowth after weed whacking may be more flush with the ground, which makes it a little harder to follow up with additional weed whacking. But if you do keep it up and keep weed whacking these plants, it might be possible to suppress them and to prevent flowering and seed set until eventually the summer heat rolls in and winds up killing the plants. Now, here again, this will only work in relatively small populations, or at least it'll only be totally effective in small populations. Certainly a valiant effort can set back that seed production. And here again, be aware of allergies, because that torn up stinknet foliage that will happen when you're weed whacking them is very likely to be releasing that stinky odor We don't know exactly whether the allergies are reactions to the stinky odor or to the pollen. So that again is an area for more study. If you weed whack these plants, you can just leave the cut stems, the weed whack stems on the ground, and they do not appear to mature and start setting seed if you've weed whacked them somewhere in the earlier mid-flowering stage. However, if you're weed whacking these when those flowering heads are already turning tan colored, already starting to go to seed, then all bets are off. But it still may be helpful if that's your only opportunity to whack them at that time, because we really don't know exactly what stage after those seed heads start turning tan. We don't know when that seed truly becomes viable and when it's still dependent on being supported by the parent plant. So basically, go ahead if you can and whack these, although it probably is not going to be productive if they really have totally gone to seed. A hula hoe or a rake can be very effective for eliminating weed seedlings from residential scale properties, especially if you've got a gravel mulched landscape. So this here is a picture of the tip of a hula hoe. A vigorous back and forth motion through the gravel will chop off seedlings at the roots, and stinknet will not regrow from roots, though it could regrow from a stem that's still left attached to roots. And this use of a rake or hula hoe is really the best recommended weed combat tool for residential sized situations. It might take you a bit of time, but it's a good workout. And it's most effective against young seedlings. It does become impractical against larger or strongly rooted weeds, or if you've got weeds that are growing between desirable plants, such as if you've got a cactus garden and you have weeds coming up between cacti. So stinknet control using herbicides. Research is underway to determine the best approaches for herbicide control of stinknet. For standard residential properties, the best approach is to be vigilant against weeds as they start to appear, and to use mechanical controls, such as a hula hoe, to eliminate those weeds while they're still in the young seedling stage. Now, I'm frequently asked what to spray to eliminate stinknet from acres of natural vegetation that's become infested with stinknet. Now, I'm going to be upfront and say I don't have an answer. And this is why invasive species are a real and serious problem. Once an invasive weed has established large populations in a natural environment, it becomes very difficult and maybe impossible to eradicate the weed. There are no simple answers that you can get from a bottle of chemical without bringing on other environmental hazards. Addressing these situations requires an informed and deliberately timed approach. For instance, stinknet at the stage you see in the photograph here, mature stinknet that's in bloom and is starting to go to seed, that stinknet really should have been addressed much earlier, especially if you intended to use herbicides. It really should have been addressed much earlier in the growing season before it got to this state of growth. Application of chemicals across large areas of desert environment should be a project for a licensed pesticide applicator and really not regarded as a DIY project by those without training. If you are going to use herbicides, remember that the label is the law. And by label, I don't mean the sticker on the front of the bottle. I mean the long booklet of instructions, which is taped to the back of the bottle and written in tiny print. Herbicide use requires following the regulations on the label, including the stipulations for the kinds of environments where the chemical may be used. Proper PPE, or personal protective equipment, must be worn, and usually that entails a lot more than a COVID face mask. Your neighborhood or municipality may have additional regulations about herbicide use. I strongly recommend hiring a professional certified pesticide applicator to treat difficult or extensive weed infestations. Also, the time to bring in a professional treatment is going to be early in the stinknet growth phase and not when it's blooming or starting to go to seed, not at the last moment. Now, with those caveats being said, I will talk here a bit about herbicides to promote a better understanding. There are many kinds of herbicides and many kinds of herbicide products. Many of the products on the shelf here contain the same active ingredients. They're just marketed differently by different manufacturers. On the other hand, similar sounding product names, usually something like extended weed killer, may actually contain different mixtures of different chemicals. You will need to read the fine print on the back of the bottle for a listing of the active ingredients. Remember that herbicides only kill living, growing plants, not seeds. Herbicides will not remove dead brush. Large weeds killed by herbicides will remain standing on site. I was getting calls over the summer from homeowners wanting to know what to spray to get rid of stinknet on their property. It was obvious they did not have stinknet growing on their property in the summer. What they had was dead stinknet, dead brush standing on their property. Herbicide chemicals will not remove this brush, nor will herbicides kill seeds on top of these dried stinknet plants. Remember, if you wait and spray weeds with herbicides only after the weeds got large, those weeds will be harder to kill than young seedlings. And if you do kill them, the dead weeds will still be left standing in place. Now, this dead brush will eventually crumble and decompose, but until then, it can be a fire hazard, and it's recommended to physically remove this brush from the vicinity around structures to fireproof your environment, at least fireproof the area around any structures that could burn. So here are some more terms that are good to be familiar with. Active ingredient, the chemical that actually kills the plant. Adjuvant, sticking agent, or spreader sticker. These are other chemicals that are added to the formulation, which help the active ingredient enter into the plant. Mode of action, the way the active ingredient kills the plant. There are many different modes of action. These are various different ways a plant may be killed using different active ingredients. These different modes of action block or disrupt different aspects of the plant's metabolism or functioning. Licensed pesticide applicators have access to a larger variety of herbicides with different active ingredients, more than what is available over the counter at your local hardware store. These restricted pesticides may be more toxic or more hazardous, but not if they are applied correctly. An over-the-counter chemical might be more toxic or more environmentally damaging if it is used incorrectly than would be a restricted pesticide when it is used correctly. And that's because the frequent manner of misuse of chemicals is to over-apply the chemical under the assumption that more is better. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup and in many other herbicide brands, has shown effectiveness in Arizona for post-emergent stinknet control. It is sometimes recommended that an adjuvant, such as methylated seed oil or MSO, may be added to glyphosate to increase its effectiveness, but that's not entirely necessary. In other words, if you want to kill stinknet with an herbicide, glyphosate is both very effective and it is the most commonly available ingredient in most of the over-the-counter herbicide products. Keep in mind, it may take several days or weeks for a glyphosate application to visibly kill the plants. And that's because the mode of action for glyphosate takes longer to work inside a plant than some of the other kinds of herbicide will. Also be clear that glyphosate has the potential to kill most other plants which it contacts. So you either have to spray exclusively the stinknet or be prepared for collateral damage if other plants, other seedlings are being sprayed. Now, I'm not going to go into the controversy over human health risks regarding glyphosate or Roundup. That is a whole other matter of dispute, which you can find discussed in length on the internet. Remember that my prime suggestion is to eliminate stinknet wherever it is possible through mechanical controls like a hula hoe, rather than going to chemical controls. You may have heard about herbicide resistance. Resistance is an evolutionary adaptation developed by populations of weeds through artificial selection promoted by the repeated use of herbicides having the same mode of action. The term herbicide resistance, when it is properly used, does not refer to an innate tolerance of a weed to certain herbicides. Instead, it refers to an increase in tolerance towards an herbicide that develops when all the vulnerable individual weeds are killed, and those weeds which survive the herbicide then go on to contribute their genes to the next generation of weeds. Now, herbicide resistance can be combated by alternating applications of different herbicides having different modes of action. Because stinknet is a new weed which has not endured generations of herbicide use, it does not display herbicide resistance. But like most weeds, some herbicides will be more effective on it than others. Selective herbicides. You may have heard about selective herbicides, herbicides which kill only certain plants and not others. Selectivity is a real phenomenon for certain herbicide products, but only across broad plant groups, such as grasses versus broadleaf weeds. In other words, monocots versus eudicots. There is no herbicide which selectively kills stinknet and does not harm other plants, nor can we expect any such chemical to be developed. Much of the selectivity possible with herbicides is achieved by applying herbicides at critical times during a target weed's life cycle. A low dose of a certain herbicide may kill weed seedlings in their early growth stage, while being insufficient to kill surrounding native perennial plants, even though the same chemical applied at a higher rate would kill those perennials. Organic or natural herbicides. There is an interest in various herbicides which are classed as organic or natural, such as vinegar or pelargonic acid. I'm not going to go into what legal requirements go into classifying these as being organic or natural. It's a kind of a labeling dispute there. Many of these products do not disrupt the plant's metabolism, but some may instead strip away the cuticle or compromise the plant epidermis, and then causing the plant to dry out in the desert environment. Now, many of these products can work against stinknet. However, they will be less powerful than traditional herbicides and may only kill small seedlings of stinknet. Also, never use table salt to kill weeds. It may work to kill them, but it also winds up ruining your environment. And perhaps you've heard about ancient invading armies that would salt the earth. Effective herbicide use depends on much more than choosing the correct herbicide. It also requires proper identification of the weed and understanding of the weed's life cycle, such as knowing when it is actively growing and when it is vulnerable. The size and growth state of the weed. Weeds are typically most vulnerable when they are actively growing young seedlings. State of active growth. You may think it would be best to spray a weed when it is stressed or dried out. But actually, the best time to apply herbicide is when the weed is healthy and actively growing. It's because when it's healthy and actively growing, that is when the weed is more likely to absorb, take in that herbicide, and transport it inside the weed. And that's when the herbicide becomes most effective. Weather and wind. Herbicides are best applied under optimal growing weather for the plant, and especially not when it's windy, because the wind can cause drift of any sprayed herbicides. And proper application. There can be a lot of subtlety to application, including the choice of sprayer nozzle and the addition of adjuvants. And all of this supports the hiring of an experienced professional to do a proper job. Pre-emergent herbicides, or pre-emergents, are chemicals which are applied to the soil to stop weed seed germination. Pre-emergent herbicides do not kill seeds. They kill seedlings in the initial stage of germination. As a result, you never wind up seeing seedlings develop and become visible on the landscape. They just never grow to the point of becoming visible. Pre-emergent herbicides have the potential to not harm actively growing plants, only killing seedlings in the initial stages of germination. This selectivity against germinating seedlings without impacting existing plants is a useful property of many pre-emergent herbicides. Now, keep in mind that some herbicide products are cocktails of both pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides, such as those promising to kill existing weeds and also having an extended control beyond that. Pre-emergent herbicides have the potential to not harm actively growing plants. Pre-emergent herbicides also do not harm seedlings which have already germinated. So it is essential to put down pre-emergents before weed seedlings have appeared. If you can see weed seedlings, it's too late for pre-emergent control. However, this is an ideal stage for post-emergent weed control using post-emergent herbicides. And post-emergent herbicides, that's the term for most of the herbicides that you just spray on an existing plant. You could also use pre-emergence now at this stage to suppress additional future seed germination, although it probably won't affect the existing seedlings. Now, pre-emergent herbicides can seem benign because they do not harm growing plants. However, in order for pre-emergent herbicides to work, they require certain chemical properties, such as a long period of active effect in the soil and a disinclination to binding with soil particles and that renders the chemical mobile and subject to leaching from the application area. Pre-emergent herbicides can seem benign because they do not harm growing plants. Nonetheless, various pre-emergent herbicides can display toxicity to fish and to birds. Pre-emergent herbicides are subject to leaching from the application site and entering groundwater or ponds. So there are often strict regulations concerning pre-emergent herbicide use. Pre-emergent herbicides have the potential to suppress the germination of stinknet seedlings. And herbicides of this type will likely become an important tool in combating stinknet. However, I am discouraging do-it-yourself application of pre-emergents by unlicensed persons across large areas of Sonoran Desert environment because of environmental concerns. Instead, leave projects of this sort to licensed professionals who can offer an educated appraisal of the situation and who are licensed to apply the chemical. The proper use of pre-emergence against stinknet continues to be an area of study by researchers both in and outside of academia in both Arizona and California, and possibly Australia as well. In cooperative extension, we help to answer questions from the public about their garden and landscape plant problems. We have received many calls about sick or deformed plants and have determined many of these result from improper herbicide use. Often, herbicides were used to control annual weeds and wind up poisoning trees and shrubs. Herbicide effects can be seen as abnormal prolific branching, stunted plants, scorched or dead plants. A telltale sign that these problems are herbicide caused is when similar symptoms appear on different unrelated plants within the landscape. These problems often are related to use of products applied to the soil, claiming to have extended action or long-term weed suppression in the soil. These varieties of pre-emergent herbicides, often classified as soil sterilants, should be discouraged from use in most landscapes. These problems we see here may have resulted from improper use or over-application of the herbicide products. So although pre-emergent herbicides are generally characterized as not harming adult plants, if the herbicide is used incorrectly, all kinds of havoc could result. Future control methods against stinknet can be expected to be IPM, integrated pest management techniques. These might possibly involve vigilant mechanical removal of plants, careful sanitation, biological control, selective plant competition, and careful use of herbicides. For instance, attention to use of clean soil and gravel for landscape and construction projects. For instance, don't ship out soil from these soil piles to use as fill soil in a landscape, because the soil from these piles overgrown with stinknet would be filled with stinknet seed and would spread the plant. Brittlebush, Encelia farinosa, is a native Sonoran Desert perennial which can possibly overshade and exclude stinknet. Does the intentional promotion of brittlebush have the potential to compete against stinknet? This and other lines of research are needed to develop a multi-pronged approach to combat stinknet without compromising our Sonoran Desert environment. So thank you, and keep battling those weeds.
Thank you so much, Michael. We have about 20 minutes. Obviously, we don't have to use all that time, but I did want to get to some of the questions that we had. Let me go back a little bit here. And there was actually one question that I wanted to get to in regards to the SignNet map.
Okay.
that we were looking at the beginning. And Sean was asking what the difference is in that map between the triangle points of data and the circular points of data. I don't know if you know the difference, but yeah, we'd love to hear your
Yeah, I
thoughts.
believe that the triangles represent observations that are not represented by a herbarium specimen, whereas the circles are have a documented dried plant specimen deposited at a herbarium as you know the really best form of documentation.
Awesome. Perfect. And then Juanita, yes, a lot of these links that Michael was shared with us and that I shared in the chat, except for the Plant Press article that just came out recently, those are in the SWVMA website, which I will put the link, folks. There's more information there as well. A question from Ann Hutchinson, will the rains these past few days cause a super bloom? And we're kind of talking a little bit about that before we started, but I don't know if you could address the issue of the rains right now.
Certainly, we will not have a super bloom of native wildflowers. We will be lucky if we even get a spattering of native wildflowers. Now, for a super bloom event to happen, you really need that rain to start in October or November to really get the plants growing. Because if you think about it, that's what happened the last 2 winters. We got heavy rains in October or early November. So those plants all had at least 3 months of growth before the time we're at now. So now they've only got like about 3 months or so left before they would be blooming. So I think that we can expect, well, we don't know the full story now because we don't know whether we're going to get follow-up rains after this. And if we do, that will be good for all plants, both weeds and natives. But even if we do get continuing rain through the winter, we're just not going to have the time for the kind of growth that we need for a super bloom.
Yeah, and even blooming of stinknet as well, right? As you were saying before.
Mm-hmm.
And I do have a question from Claire, and we were talking about the differences between the wilderness areas and the residential landscapes. But is there any other alternatives that you know of? And I think you've touched on this, that to Roundup or glyphosate that you could elucidate to.
Like I say, there are other products, and there is research going on by people at the universities and in among other outside of academia, among some of the pesticide applicators are doing some of their own research, because there is a market there. There's a call for this. People will pay someone to control their stinknet. But so they're chiefly looking though at chemicals. They're looking at making their own tank mixture, adding their own adjuvants. Basically, they're doing all of this detail that is largely not known to the homeowner, and with chemicals that may not even be available. So if you're not a licensed pesticide applicator, your best bet is just going to be using glyphosate, or you may try some of those organic products. It's worth trying them, especially if you do get some germination right after these rains. You may have a hard time knowing whether you've got stinknet seedlings or something else. You might choose just to eliminate those seedlings, with a hula ho or with a chemical, regardless. Just it depends on what grows in the area, and right. What balance you want to take as far as the survival of any plants.
Yeah.
But yeah, so a lot of the research is going into the kind of approach that the professionals are going to take.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. And then you did touch on this quite extensively at the end of your presentation about pre-emergence and how that could really be at least a key in this whole battle against stinknet, and especially when we're talking about timing and how important timing is in applying not only pre-emergent but post-emergent as well, obviously. So Barry, I know you asked about pre-emergence, and is physically removing each plant or hula hoeing the best way to contain them. And as Michael said, that is one of the best recommendations that he can give. And again, just really watching out for those seedlings and that right time to get at them. Following up though, Barry did ask, what month do you suggest a professional weed application person spray stinknet?
So it's not a matter of the month, it's a matter of the growth stage of stinknet. So if I was to say that stinknet germinates in November, which it has the past couple winters, then that would be the month. but November of this year did not have any stinknet. So if you basically the best time to control stinknet is going to be with a post-emergent after germination or with a pre-emergent before germination. So if you were going to hire someone to apply a pre-emergent herbicide, probably not the thing you want to do this winter, because we've already had the rains. I mean, if you had them on quick dial and you got them out there tomorrow, you might be able to get it before anything has actually started to germinate. And I'm not really sure just to, on the day, how many days after the rain or snow that the very first germination happens and it gets beyond that process. That's a little bit cutting it fine there.
Yeah.
But generally you're looking at putting down pre-emergent herbicide before any rains would stimulate germination, or after the rains, after you start getting little green seedlings start to appear. And that also would be the best time for any of those organic or natural products to be effective, is right at that time. But there again, we don't know exactly which ones are most effective. That is something that someone else at the university and cooperative extension is starting to look at, because there is interest in that.
Yeah. All right, and so I do have a question here from Kathleen. Would covering small patches of stinknet so that weed cannot photosynthesize kill the weed, or maybe cause the weed to elongate to the edge of the cover? I don't know if that's something you can, yeah.
So that's a process called solarization, where you put down, often black plastic or even cardboard over young weeds will snuff them out. And since stinknet seeds are so tiny, there's very little energy in there. So they're not even likely to be able to grow out around a cover because they've only got a little bit of energy that they'll exhaust and then they're through. So yeah, that solarization can certainly work against stinknet. The problem is it will also kill other seedlings. And also if you do a large scale solarization, it's really more of a problem in the summer, but it can heat up the soil to where it will kill the roots of trees and shrubs. But that's chiefly a problem if you're doing that in the summer to kill summer weeds.
Right. All right, so one from Rachel, and this is going back to where stinknet originates from. And I think you talked about this a little bit, but is there a herbivore, a natural boundary, or any other context in South Africa that has been found to provide a means of suppressing the growth of stinknet that you're aware of?
I don't know. That article in Desert Plants gives a little bit more information about what is known in Australia, and also the way stinknet has been combated in Australia. They're just the way stinknet is a little behaving a little differently in Arizona than it did in California. It also behaved and was controlled a little differently in Australia. So there's some interesting things to look at there, and certainly reasons to explore in South Africa to learn more about this plant. And especially we'd be interested in any kind of biological controls. There is some possible avenues that are mentioned in that Desert Plants publication, but does need more study, particularly to address that.
Yeah. And Paul, and we did talk about this a little bit, Paul, the animals don't eat stinknet. No, they don't. Birds don't seem to like it either. We haven't seen any cases of that. Is it the taste, the smell, bad digestion, like a lack of training or familiarity? And I think it might be a little bit of all of that, or at least some element to that it is, from what we're finding, not that I know of. I don't know, Michael, if you have anything else to add to that.
Usually when a plant develops these kind of stinky or oily properties, it is to deter herbivores, herbivore generalists. And what we often find is that there often can be an animal or an insect that develops a workaround, a tolerance for that. And that's what we would like to try to look for in regards to a biological control, particularly a beetle or a caterpillar or a mite or something that will live on this plant that can tolerate the stinky chemicals it makes, but doesn't really want to go on to other plants and will just attack the stinknet.
Yeah. I have a question from John Crane. How does stinknet pollinate?
Well, we really don't know. And I have heard some anecdotes that it might be relying a lot on self-pollination, but that hasn't been, it's not known to me.
All right. Well, more to learn, right? So another question here from Catherine. What would be the long-term impact to native wildflowers if pre-emergents are used?
Well, the pre-emergent herbicides are also not selective in any way, just against stinknet. So those pre-emergent herbicides will also suppress the germination of any other native seeds in the soil. Again, there may be some selectivity, usually on the level of monocot versus dicot or eudicot. So often you'll have some pre-emergents that'll suppress grass germination without harming your broadleaf plants, or vice versa. But I'd expect that any pre-emergents that are effective against stinknet are also going to suppress the lupins and the poppies and all the common wildflowers.
Yeah. And we have one question here from Willie. Hi, Willie. I like the idea you alluded to at the end of the talk, the use of native plant competition from plants like brittle-bush, I did too, to compete or outcompete stinknet. Are there specific native winter annuals you suggest to seed areas with?
Oh, that's the cutting edge of research there. So I don't know what to say, because it's only been a couple winters where we really saw this huge growth of stinknet. But it does like sunny conditions. It doesn't seem to prosper if it's being shaded out itself. And that's where that suggests that the brittle bush, which is larger growing, it's a robust plant. It's also one that people like to have around. It's a great plant.
All right, almost there. Let's see here. Linda, I do have the publication that Michael did on Stinknet. It is a little bit further up in the chat. I'll be sure to post it down a little bit further in case you weren't here at the moment. Lisa Rivera said she found Stinknet growing under brittle-bush in her yard. Not sure if that was an anomaly or if native plant cover isn't that much of a deterrent to Stinknet growth. And this was seen last spring. So, Stinknet, yeah.
Yeah, like I say, this is still on the hypothesis level there. It definitely is something that needs a lot more work. And also the other problem is that with any kind of weed like this that's so prosperous, it's going to start its own evolution, and it's going to possibly develop herbicide resistance. It's possibly going to develop more shade tolerance. It's just the way evolution works.
Right. Yeah. Sean, yes, thank you so much, Willie, for sharing that. We do have a Desert Invaders sheet of other species of concern. I invite you to look at that. And there's a couple other species. Of course, buffalo grass is a huge one, along others. We have one question here from Sierra. Stinknet was not added to the noxious weed list, as we know, until recently, last year, because of the moratorium on all state rule changes in 2008 and 2014. Is there any way we can move to exclude the weed list from future moratoriums to prevent the situation from happening again? Anything policy related that you recommend or suggest that we could possibly do?
I believe that there was some language submitted with the latest work by the Southwest Vegetation Management Association that was intended to make it easier to list the weeds, but I haven't looked at that part of it. I was only just looking at the weeds on the list. But the group to contact about that is the Southwest Vegetation Management Association.
That's correct, folks. They have some good information, and they're doing also a lot of research in terms of treatment and possible avenues for treatment as well. So I do invite you to take a look at their website and see what they're recommending as well and what they're coming out with. Let me see here. We have like a couple more minutes left. If there's any other questions or any other comments, please go ahead and share them. Thank you so much, folks, for attending. Last minute notes, we will have this recorded webinar on Casca's YouTube page. And then also, Michael, if you don't mind, obviously sharing maybe your email with us, or at least the Maricopa County Extension Office is a great place to get more information about your landscape plants and any plants, as you saw, that they have a lot of other avenues and resources that they can share with folks. Let's see here. Just a couple more minutes, you guys, for any other questions. Is there here we go, from Pam. Is there anything that requires landowners to control invasive plants on their properties?
Where there may be requirements might specifically come from your homeowners association or your neighborhood association. So I think you probably want to look at your local level and see there whether there are any requirements. Certainly among homeowners associations, they sometimes can be strict about that.
And if they're not, I recommend you be a champion for this and maybe get it on their radar. I know that they, we always have a lot to learn, and I think HOAs don't want to do the wrong thing, but perhaps they do need a little bit of updating in terms of what plants they're using in their landscape and so forth. So definitely an avenue to look at. And all right, I think that's it. I don't see any more questions coming through. Like I said, folks, thanks so much for joining us. And this will be recorded. This has been recorded. It will be on our YouTube. And so thank you all so much. And I hope you guys have a really good evening. Again, thank you, Michael. This was great. And I learned a lot myself too. And I didn't know about Lake Perry. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Lake Paris.
Paris, yeah. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, thank you guys. Thank you so much. Have a great night. Thanks, Michael. I'm going to go ahead and end the chat now. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.